Hi, Jacquelyn. To start, why don't you answer the question you brought up first, which is, why do we need diversity in clinical trials?
Well, thank you, Dylan, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. Diversity in clinical trials is something that's near and dear to my heart. It's very personal for me. It's an area I'm very passionate about. It's really what has drove my career, and that's because my father struggled with bipolar disorder. And when he was treated with antipsychotic medications, my father ended up developing tardive dyskinesia. And back then, we were not aware that African Americans, as treated with antipsychotics with bipolar, were at an increased risk of having adverse side effects. So my career has been driven by the importance of trying to find better drugs for all people. And so when you ask why is diversity needed in clinical trials, it's because the individuals with diverse backgrounds have the higher disease burden, such as diabetes, such as cancer, and other serious medical health conditions, including mental health issues. And if we don't have diversity in clinical trials, we are lacking in terms of developing the most effective medications for all people. And the FDA did a review of their medications approved between 2014 and 2021 and found that only 20% of these medications, 20% of the drugs approved were treated in African Americans. And when we look at the drug snapshot, which the FDA instituted in 2015, of the drugs that were approved in 2021, and when you look at heart, blood, kidney, and endocrine diseases, which will include hypertension, which includes diabetes and other heart diseases, you see that 98% of the participants were white, whereas only 6 to 7% were Black, and then 3 to 17% were Hispanic. So there's some improvement, especially when it comes to recruiting women and gender in clinical trials, but currently there's still room for more improvement so that we develop medications that are effective for all, because we know that people have different presentations in terms of their disease presentation, in terms of how they respond to medications.
That's very informative. So one of the things you and I discussed offline was the examples of genetic and biological differences between minority and ethnic groups. How have those presented challenges in this context?
So when you talk about genetic and biological differences, we all know that no two people respond exactly the same, even those within the same, ethnic group. So when you factor in difference between women and hormones, and you factor in pharmacokinetics, the way we metabolize or absorb or respond to medications, we know that there's going to be differences. So again, if we don't take these factors into consideration, if they're not looked at in clinical trials, we end up marketing medications that may not work as well in all patients, or some patients may experience side effects. The CDC recently reported that 1.3 million ER admissions are for adverse events, and over 300 patients are admitted to the hospital for adverse events. So an example that I like to use is the fact that ACE inhibitors are an antihypertensive medication that seem to work well in white people, but there's data that suggests that it's less effective in African Americans, as well as African Americans are almost 5 times as likely to develop angioedema, which is a severe adverse effect to ACE inhibitors. Also, tamoxifen is another drug that I like to highlight, because originally it was thought that Blacks did not respond as well to tamoxifen, but a subgroup analysis has subsequently shown that Blacks and whites equally respond the same if the patients are diagnosed with ER-positive breast cancer. So these are just a couple. And I also found that the FDA actually approved a drug. I don't know if I'm pronouncing the name right, but it's called Bildil, for congestive heart failure in African Americans. The sponsors had done a study, and they did 2 large studies, and the drug was looking like it was a failure, and it failed in general. But when they did a subgroup analysis, it showed that the drug was effective in African Americans, and the FDA has approved that drug. for congestive heart failure. So those are some examples.
Those are great examples. You mentioned the FDA, and they've been in the news as recently as February 16th. So what role has the FDA played to improve diversity in clinical trials? And what do you think of the impact of their recent draft guidance on diversity plans?
So over the years, over decades, the FDAs have put into many guidance around collecting and improving diversity in clinical trials, but it really focused around collection of data. There were guidances that came out in the 70s, in the 90s, and even in 2000s that focus more on how the data should be collected, how it needs to be standardized, how it needs to be presented. But in 2020, the FDA had their first guidance document that really, I think, honed in on how to improve the eligibility of diverse patients in clinical trials. And this is something that I think all sponsors and sites should really look at and review, because there's a lot of merit in that document. And then this recent 22 guidance on the clinical plan, I feel builds on that, because it's good in the sense, and it's welcomed by the scientific community, and that it's showing us that we really need to require it, unfortunately, because although we've made headway, we also know that based on the COVID-19 epidemic, we saw that there were still some gaps in how we recruit in clinical studies, as well as how patients are treated. And so this guidance will help guide sponsors. It's welcomed, and it speaks to the fact that it's important. Now, when it was originally written, it was written as a recommendation, as a guidance, and there's been a lot of discussion because the FDA seemed to have overemphasized the fact that this would not be a binding document, but that it was a guidance. And again, it was well written, or it was written in a way to help standardize how the format, how it should be presented, and when to come before the FDA to discuss it. But it was not, it emphasized that it was not required. But in December 2022, legislators, the president, others heard the noise about it needing to be required, I feel, and now it is the law. And so therefore, it's not going to be optional. It's going to be required. It's going to be the law. So the guidance that was put out in April 2022 will undergo additional revisions, and part of the revision will now state that it will be required. Now, is requiring it enough? It depends, because we really don't know whether or not how it's going to be enforced, how it's going to be monitored. And so there are two trains of thought. Should there be consequences, or should there be incentives? And right now we know that there's consequences. For example, when Moderna was developing its vaccine for COVID, it slowed the enrollment so that they could recruit more diverse people into the study, so that we can understand the safety and efficacy. So the FDA has the option of slowing the studies, sending people, sending sponsors back to continue to do additional work, or to incentivize. And there are so many that also are proponents of incentivizing, because when you look at the Orphan Drug Act of 1983, and when you look at the Pediatric Research Act of 2003, you see that the FDA has incentivized the study of rare diseases. And so now there are many, many more rare disease studies that are underway, and more drugs for rare diseases. And there are a lot more pediatric patients that are being studied. So need to look at fast track, tax incentives, additional exclusivity. These are things that hopefully the FDA may look at and discuss in the guidance that will come out when it's required.
That's great. You talked a little bit about what's happening now. Could you talk somewhat about the past a little bit? What has been the cost of inaction prior to this point, more in human terms than financial?
Yeah, and the cost of inaction is that lack of diversity in clinical trials cost us billions. There was a report in Stats News in August of 2022 that said that it can lead to early death as well as poor health outcomes. And we all know about the poor health outcomes. Again, I keep going back to COVID-19, but we saw that people that had poor health quality, had poor outcomes when it came to contracting COVID-19. Again, it adds to hospitalization and hospital costs. It adds to the lack of effective treatments being available sooner. And it could also lead to, again, patients not knowing whether or not drugs are going to be working well, and either they're not going to be effective or serious adverse effects will occur in patients that could be avoided if we included more patients of diverse backgrounds, so that we know that the medicines work well for all people.
Another question that we discussed was the reluctance among some communities to participate in clinical trials. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, first and foremost, it's because of diminished trust in the medical system and the government because of historical mistreatment. And not that I expect people to go on an apology tour, but we have to acknowledge what has happened in the past. We have to acknowledge that when we look back from African-American, Hispanic, and Indigenous women through the medical community have been sterilized without their consent. When we look at the Tuskegee study, and for 30 years, men went without treatment for syphilis. And even when we talk about Henrietta Lacks, the HeLa cell that's used today broadly to help the medical community find cures for different diseases, especially in cancer and other areas. However, the family was not, never gave permission or was not compensated. And we still are not clear on whether and how much they may have been compensated. So when we look at all of these factors, and then when we look at healthcare, again, looking at the disease burden that continues to exist being higher in African-American communities, this is part of the reason why there's reluctance for African-Americans to participate in clinical trials. But we have to do everything we can to educate and bring people along. But because of the historical, and even today, there are many doctors and medical students that still believe that African-Americans have thicker skin, therefore we have a higher pain tolerance, and therefore patients don't need as much pain medication. And this is a huge problem in patients with sickle cell disease. So it's this ongoing problem. It hasn't been resolved. We need to acknowledge it, but we need to do everything we can to move forward to reduce the reluctance.
Speaking of the reluctance, what specific solutions exist to mitigate that in underserved communities that need to be included in clinical trials?
Yeah, so there are solutions that are ongoing, but I have to say that we all must take a part. It's not just pharma, it's not just the sites. We all have to take a part in improving, to mitigate the reluctance. And part of that is not just for African Americans, but for Hispanics and underserved, but for all patients. Patients need to be the center of the protocol. We need to do sponsors need to do a better job of getting the voice of the patient and the patient advocates early on in the protocol development process. It's not appropriate to wait until after the protocol is finished and then get the input. Need to get the input from patients early on. And then when you start talking about minority and underserved populations, you need their input in terms of looking at the number of visits. Is the inclusion criteria going to be exclusionary for them? Whether or not there's additional out-of-pocket cost. A lot of underserved patients may not have health insurance. So if a study is requiring additional procedures or additional medications that the sponsor may think is covered by their insurance, well, if they don't have insurance, then they will not have anything to cover those additional costs. So you need to get the input of the patient advocates and the patients early on. You need to broaden the eligibility criteria, making sure that quality is always first and foremost, but look at some of the exclusion criteria. Are we being too restrictive, especially when it gets to phase 2B and phase 3? Do the eligibility criteria need to be a little bit more broader for patients with comorbidity? And that's where I really like the 2020 guidance from the FDA on improving eligibility. That's a really good document that I recommend that people really look at, because it does highlight looking at what factors in terms of childcare. We have to, do things differently in terms of times that doctors, our investigators have office visits, taking off work. And when we talk about underserved, we're also talking about those that may live in more rural areas. How can they get to the doctor's office? So where are we putting our studies? So using decentralized clinical trials, which was used a lot during COVID-19, there's a place for decentralized trials that we should continue. We've shown that it works, as well as hybrid, where you could do some decentralized and some at site visits. But how many visits? Are the visits overwhelming? Are the procedures overwhelming? So getting the patient's input, looking at a broader swipe of the eligibility criteria, and then making sure that, sponsors and others are talking to patients about the importance of why they should be in the study. What is it in it for them?
So very good stuff. So one of the other things we talked about was community advocacy groups. Could you give some examples of successes there as far as improving clinical trial diversity?
Yeah, when it comes to patient advocacy groups, sponsors that developed the vaccines for COVID-19 relied heavily on community advocacy groups. And it really worked really well through social media, through blogs, through advertisement. And also, and I know one of the things at Pfizer, what they did, it had advisory or advocates come in and look at and review the protocol and review the informed consent. And this is, I thought that really, really worked well. And we saw that it worked really well. Oncology is another area that is heavily invested in working with community advocacy groups. But in this area, I feel that there's more needed in terms of working with our community advocacy groups to ensure that they have diversity within the advocacy groups and are able to reach out and are trusted in the community. Because when you look at your cancer studies, there's still very low numbers in terms of recruitment of studies with African Americans, Hispanics, when it comes to breast cancer, when it comes to prostate cancer, multiple myeloma. So working with advocacy groups we've seen it work, COVID-19, oncology studies and other studies, but more needs to be done. Pediatric studies, some of the rare diseases, working with advocacy groups have been really, really helpful, but more is needed in that area.
Another thing we discussed was fostering diversity within the pharma industry, CROs and sites itself. Could you talk a little bit about the importance of that?
Yeah, diversity, as I had said earlier, we all have to get involved, and diversity must be built into the fabric of a company. It must be at the core of an organization that diversity, inclusion, and equity is important. It's in their SOPs. You see it in their workforce. Because if you have a workforce, many times companies will have either colleague resource groups or affinity groups, and they can also utilize these groups as sounding boards before they go to the patients and advocates. So having a diverse workforce means that you have diverse thinking, you're getting input from populations that we're trying to get more involved in clinical trials. And maybe there are things that, your diverse colleagues that are participating on your teams may know that someone else may not know. When you're developing your recruitment materials, you have people to kind of run things by in terms of looking at whether or not your materials are diverse enough or not, and selecting sites, selecting investigators to work with. And it's vitally important that we do a better job, and sponsors are helping to improve our pool of diverse investigators, in terms of principal investigators that are Indigenous, that are Hispanic, African American, so that when patients come to the clinical trial site, they see patients that look at them. And there was some recent data that showed that some of the inner or more urban cities and institutions and academic institutions that are in areas where there's a more diverse population, if they have a more diverse staff, that does appear to help with enrollment in clinical studies.
Just looking at time here, we time for about one more question, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. How can education and marketing help? What role can they play?
Yes, it's vitally important that education and marketing, more so the education, and through working with, again, your community advocates, working through your churches, working through trusted individuals and locations that minority participants may, frequent, in terms of having brochures at community centers or whatever, or going in and doing talks and discussions, and not just going in and being done once and done when you're interested in something, but ongoing education around the diseases, for example, around diabetes, around Alzheimer's disease. I remember when I served on the Alzheimer's board in Michigan, we were working with the churches, and this was back in the early 2000s, and many of the churches did not want to acknowledge that Alzheimer's disease was a problem in the Black community. And now we know today, fast forward almost 15 years, we see higher disease burden in terms of dementia, and Alzheimer's dementia in the Alzheimer's community. So education is vitally key. And then using social media, using your advertisement. And I think companies are doing a much better job of, in the advertisement that we see on social media, on television, around medications, for people to see people that look like them taking the medication is vitally important. Great.
So just one more question, and then we'll see where we are in terms of discussion. There have been successes, especially in recent years, in fostering clinical trial diversity. Could you talk a little bit about how we can build on what we've done right in the last several years, and also in the preceding decades even?
Yeah, I think we just need to build on the momentum that exists right now, build on the momentum of what worked well with COVID. There's a lot of lessons learned from what worked well in terms of public service announcements, in terms of working with advocates, in terms of working with the community. It can't be a one and done because of the lack of trust that people have with healthcare, with government. This has to be an ongoing effort, and it has to be all hands on deck for people, within industry and in the healthcare system. I think that what needs to be incorporated is when patients go to their doctors, if they are talked to regularly about clinical trials and they trust their doctors or someone in the doctor's office that they talk to, it should be incorporated as part of their treatment options. It shouldn't be this one-off thing. So if someone is seeing their doctor for diabetes or hypertension, and we know that there's going to be studies, then that's something that should be routinely discussed with with the patient by their doctor, so that it does not come to them as a surprise. Because if we improve access to clinical trials, it will ultimately improve overall health outcomes and healthcare access. I also think that to improve upon it, I really hope and looking forward to the FDA incentivizing this in terms and not punishing, because we know that people respond better to incentives. So there may be the need for consequences, but hopefully we'll see more incentives in terms of, the role. We'll see more involvement, as you guys are going to talk about, more involvement with technology as it relates to the centralized clinical trials and other areas of technology and advancements.
So Great. So just opening it up to questions now, we have one in the chat. Will the FDA guidance affect medical devices or just, pharmaceutical manufacturers?
Medical devices, from what I remember when I read the guidance, were also included. But I'll have to double check on that. And again, it was the draft guidance, so we'll have to see what the final outcome will be.
When it comes to DCTs to address diversity, how do you see the adoption rate and how do you overcome the additional technological burden imposed on patients, particularly underserved patients? If some of those patients don't have access to health insurance, as you mentioned, would they have access to the adequate technology to find out about these trials in the first place? And more importantly, the knowledge to set up and use the technology remotely? It's another question.
That's an excellent question. And a lot of underserved communities may not have some of the internet access and home computers, but that's where, again, the support from the sponsors and from the site comes in. But one thing we do know is that most people have smartphones. And so on the sponsor side, we have to advance technology so that we are able to allow them to use the smartphones more in terms of, being able to participate or help them to get a smartphone, which we know there is internet access and, and that people will have access to. But that's a great question. That will remain a problem. And we all have to work at that to ensure that they do have the capabilities to participate. That's why right now hybrid is probably the best way. Reducing the number of visits will help, but definitely DCT should be continued.
So another question that came in, do you believe that the future FDA will or should reject compounds seeking approval when the subject enrollment does not reflect the diversity targets for the disease in question, whether that is gender or ethnicity or race?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I know that sometimes advisory committee members, they will vote against approving a drug that lacks diversity. FDA has sent back sponsors to do additional work, and sometimes they give them conditional approvals. Again, it should be considered, but I don't think that should be the main focus. It should be more incentivized, because I think we don't want to de-incentivize companies from developing better medications for all. So it should be an option, but I prefer using incentives to get companies to do what we need them to do in terms of the fast track, in terms of additional exclusivity.
What about this question? Will all or most drugs be required to do follow-up studies based on draft guidance? And
well, it will depend. There has been headway made in terms of improvement in diversity in studies. Again, if you look at the snapshot, you will look across studies and you will see drug approvals that in terms of women, there's definitely improvement. In terms of African Americans and Hispanic, there's improvement, but we want to see not just some sponsors doing it. We want to see all sponsors doing a better job of recruiting, African Americans, so that the drugs that are developed, the ultimate goal is that the drugs that are developed reflect the epidemiology of the disease and reflects the population, the percentage of people in the United States that for African Americans or Latinos. So there are going to probably continue to be some post-marketing studies required, because that's what they do right now, that require additional work if there's not enough diversity. So I don't see that part going away, but requiring it for all studies, I wouldn't say that will be the case if you meet the requirement.
Another question we have, and we can get into this a little bit in the technology section afterward, but what are some ways to target underrepresented populations, as they're often not seen at certain sites that are really important? How can we better find the sites that best serve them?
Yeah, it's gonna take working with, unfortunately, and I know it's, we talk about in pharma, talk about speed a lot, but it's going to be trying to work with new sites, mentoring new sites and finding investigators and finding sites where patients are reside, and doing this through, and I know you guys will talk about this more, looking at, where people live in terms of the counties, in terms of the demographic makeup in particular areas, so that sites can be either developed or, relationships can be built with other sites and other locations in more rural areas as well, so that we can incorporate these patients into the studies.
Another question that came in, what do you believe is the most important reason for the lack of racial and ethnic diversity in clinical trials? Do you believe that the lack of Black and Brown principal investigators has an impact, and how can this issue be addressed? So that's really two questions. We can take the first one.
Yeah. And I guess I don't know if there's one, read the first part of the question again.
What do you believe is the most important reason for the lack of racial and ethnic diversity in clinical trials?
Yeah, and the distrust, without a doubt, is the distrust. Unfortunately, it's going to take more time. You have family members that are still of those that went through the Tuskegee study. You have family members of Henrietta Lacks that's still around. And then when we look at the COVID epidemic, I personally had a sister-in-law that was turned away from 3 hospitals, told her she did not have COVID-19. And then she went home and went back, called her doctor, and then went to the hospital and had COVID-19, and she survived, but she went in ICU, she went on a ventilator, and that was after going to 3 hospitals and being turned away. And the third one told her, yeah, you do have COVID-19, but go home, and disregarded the seriousness. So lack of trust. Will having diverse investigators improve? Yes, but it's all about the trust. So you have to build the trust. I'm not going to say that, all white people are not trusted by patients, or all, Hispanics don't trust all white people. That's not the case. Trust is important, but will it improve clinical trial diversity if patients see staff and doctors that look like them, that are Latino, that are African-American, Indigenous? Absolutely. I believe that we have to do a better job. We have to start working at promoting clinical research as careers and opportunities for students at HBCUs and other historically Black colleges, and starting really early, trying to train people to go into this direction and to be supportive of it, because I think it will improve diversity in trials.
That looks like we're getting toward the end of questions at the moment. Anybody feel free to chime in via the chat or the Q&A function. We're happy to answer things. Take another few seconds here, make sure we don't have any more, and then we can move on to discuss technology and some of the things that can do to address clinical trials and the diversity of them. It's the question that we've kind of left open, referred to a few times when talking about targeting diverse patient populations. But this is why we have Anne and Misty here. They're going to answer some questions you guys might have about technology and clinical trials. And so first, let's give an introduction to Huma.AI, who we are, why this event is really important to us. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to you, Misty, if you could give us a rundown on, the company that's behind this event. Misty, you're on mute.
Am I off? Okay, apologies. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining this very informative event. Thank you, Jacquelyn, for all of the information. It was very interesting. So Huma.AI, we are an organization that automates data analysis and makes it easier to access clinical insights, trends, and change across data silos and divisions using everyday language. Huma.AI allows clinical development teams like yourselves to comprehend the competitive clinical trial landscape from multiple perspectives very quickly, with no need to download, cleanse, and compare data from disparate sources, including your own data. Huma.AI's visualizations provide important insights with ease. Also, Huma.AI's expert in the loop approach leads to the highest accuracy possible. Huma.AI is also a pioneer in generative AI. I'm sure you've all heard of ChatGPT at this point, and we have developed our own ChatGPT for life sciences through direct collaboration with OpenAI, which we've had a partnership with them for almost 6 months now. Huma.AI's mission is to really equip life science professionals with powerful decision-making, insights, and analysis using everyday language. So if you have any additional questions, we would love to speak with you and provide more information, and you're welcome to contact me at Misty@Huma.AI.
Thanks, Misty. That was great. So one of the things that we talked about was the role that decentralized clinical trials, DCTs, could play. Some of the roles we can play in targeting ethnic and racial diverse populations. But and we had talked before this. Could you kind of give us a rundown on some of the specific roles technology can play, both outside of the scope of Huma.AI services, and then what they can expect from us as well?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Dylan. And thank you, Jackie. We sure do have a long way to go yet. We're getting there, but baby steps and we have a ways to go. I'm happy to speak about technology, which can play a significant role in supporting the diversity in clinical trials by providing tools that make it easier to recruit diverse participants. These tools can also collect the data and monitor the outcomes. Digital outreach technologies such as social media, email, and mobile apps can help researchers contact diverse populations and encourage them to participate in clinical trials. Additionally, electronic health records, or EHRs, support diversity in clinical trials by providing valuable information about the participants' demographics, medical history, and medication use. EHRs help researchers identify potential participants for clinical trials and track their health outcomes over time. Let's talk about wearable devices such as smartphones and fitness trackers, which collect real-time data and along with telemedicine can help the researchers monitor participants remotely. This would reduce the need for in-person visits and make it easier for people to participate in trials. And finally, AI, or artificial intelligence, and machine learning can be used to analyze large amounts of data from all of these sources. The AI and machine learning can identify patterns and trends that may be difficult to identify with traditional statistical methods. These technologies can help the researchers better understand the impact of the treatments and the medications on the different populations and identify potential differences in the treatment response based upon factors such as age, gender, and race.
And AI and machine learning is definitely where Huma fits in. Thanks, Anne, and thanks, Misty, as well, for giving a background on what Huma.AI does from the technology side. Looks like we have a few more questions that have come in.
Great.
Talked about the technology's role in this challenge. One of the questions is, this is, I believe, for Jacquelyn. Do you have any comments regarding other populations that focus their treatment more on herbal and Eastern medicine and are unlikely to accept Western medicine? Good one. Jacquelyn?
Yeah, that's a really good one, and that's really hard. Yeah, when you talk about indigenous populations, as well as, Asian and Asian Pacific Islander, populations are more likely to use, herbal and other remedies. And also across, I think, depending on where you look at in terms of Hispanic and some African Americans from the Caribbean and other areas, they may as well use more herbal remedies. Again, it goes back to trust, it goes back to education, and not a one and done. Building those relationships are going to take time. And if advocacy groups and patients feel like you're just there to get something from them and that you're gone, then you're going to, sponsors will erode away the trust that we're trying to build. So when you're building your programs in terms of education, need to help people to understand, don't put down what they're doing, but educate them about, medications that have been approved and that have been studied with large number of people, and people, and that they may at some point need to take this medication. And so therefore it will be helpful to know that it may work, that it's going to work, and that it's going to be safe. But yeah, that's going to be a tough one. I agree.
So it looks like we have a question. I think, Anne, this might be one you can take. What is the role that customer success plays in a technology like Huma.AI at a life science company? How does that factor into the success of an implementation?
Oh, great question. Customer success is essential because our role within the organization and working with our partner pharmaceutical companies is to ensure success when utilizing our solutions. If we're not helping the end user utilize these solutions effectively and efficiently, ultimately patients aren't getting what they need. So we play a significant role in training, developing, and also using the voice of the customer to further develop roadmaps to further support technology and its development along the path of drug development.
Looks like another one came in, and this might be Anne as well. I think this is based on a study I also read recently. So many AI implementations fail, as many as 95%. What are the keys to successfully implementing AI at a major life science company, from POC to pilot to at scale? What is your experience in that area? And could you open up a bit about that?
Yeah, great. I too have seen many AI implementations fail along the way. What I can say is in the most recent this year, in the last 12 months, AI has made significant progress in its capabilities and its ability to understand natural language as well as scientific language. So what we're finding now is with a platform such as Huma's and or any kind of AI organization that's sitting agnostically on top of disparate data sources, bringing those data sources together to provide insights and intelligence easily and effectively is where it's headed. And in the last 6 months, I have seen this change considerably. Actually, it's been pretty exciting for me in the role that I sit, whereby I'm able to where our customers are able to quickly identify the insights and the intelligence, not only from publicly held data, but from both their structured and unstructured data as well.
And I think this one might be a good one for Misty. What kind of demand are you seeing for generative AI chat GPT? You mentioned that service. What's it like out there? Is there a lot of support for that you're seeing in the companies you're reaching out to?
Yeah, so it's a great question. Anne and I are just freshly back from Scope. So there was a lot of buzz about AI and so forth. So what we're seeing, or what we were hearing with all the sessions and the clients we talked to, is there's a lot of excitement. There's a lot of thoughts about utilization and how this can be applied internally, but they're not really always quite sure how to get there. So obviously, in speaking with us, we're very excited to share, how we do it in our methodology, and the fact that we're partnering with OpenAI, who is, obviously has developed ChatGPT. So there's definitely a lot of buzz, and I think organizations are trying to move towards that because they see the value, right? They see that it can be so helpful in these types of issues like diversity, and how it can be help them find the solution or the answers they need and the patients they need, develop better trials to help serve the patients better. So we're definitely seeing a shift in the industry towards that direction, and we're very excited to be poised to help our clients out.
I think we have one more. Maybe you just mentioned scope. There's a question. Did you guys see anything or have any discussions at scope where diversity in clinical trials were mentioned, or technologies that could enable those were mentioned, things like decentralized clinical trials? You guys were both there. What did you see on the ground?
Yeah, we absolutely did. Anne, do you want to comment on that? I know you're excited about that one.
Yeah, honestly, that's one of the key things that a lot of people were talking. Diversity in clinical trials is at the forefront of everybody's mind right now. It's essential that we get there, that we don't just look at, your traditional populations and determine that that drugs that are good for them are good for all. So decentralized trials, the success that was had with COVID, is continuing and spreading through the different types of trials that are going on. As trials are being designed, they're also looking at ways in which they can bring the burden to a patient of being within a clinical trial. They can lessen that through decentralized trials as well as technology. So a lot of talk was had on that. It's at the forefront of everybody's minds, along with the whole ChatGPT experience as well, because honestly, all of the data needs to be analyzed and produced from that. We need the insights and the intelligence. So this is where the technology is folding into all of that discussion as well.
Yeah, and I can tag on to that. Just, session after session was talking about diversity, right? Diversity was in the title or in the content of almost all of this, many of the sessions. And we really are seeing that in our conversations with clients. I can say that probably 7 or 8 out of 10 meetings that I'm having with clients these days are talking about diversity and how they get better at this, and how do we refine that? How do we find these underserved and underrepresented populations? So it's definitely a very hot topic, and it's such an important one. So I'm so happy that we hosted this today, because I'm hoping that it was very informative for the folks that joined. And again, so grateful to Jacquelyn for being on with us today and sharing her insights. But yeah, it's definitely a very, very important topic that everyone seems to be trying to find a good solution for and solve for.
So, Jacquelyn, did you have any kind of parting thoughts you wanted to close with about some of the things you've seen in your career and the way technology has affected it, or just anything you wanted to say to kind of wrap things up here?
No, I think Anne and Mitzi did a good job at bringing it full circle. We've talked enough about the importance of it. I think everybody knows that it's important. We know now that the FDA is going to require diversity, and it's going to require all hands on deck. So technology is going to be huge, because again, the question is, again, how do I find the diverse patients? So technology will be huge there. And then when we talk about reaching patients where they're at in terms of if they live in rural areas, or if they work and they can't take off, the role of, the DCT is going to be important. So I think, again, I appreciate you reaching out to me and asking my insights on this topic. Again, it's something that, when I was in pharma, it was something that, one of the last things that I was a part of is helping to write diversity strategies. I think Pfizer is doing a great job in that area in terms of being out in the front of working on some of this area. And now, I'm here to advise others about their diversity strategy and ways to improve diversity in clinical trial. And I think it's going to take us all. So thank you.
Thank you, Jacquelyn. We're coming up on time. I know a lot of people probably have a hard stop at noon. So if you have any questions about Huma.AI or Jacquelyn's Q&A that we haven't been able to answer today, please follow up with us and we will make sure we get the email to the right person to give you the right answer. Thanks so much to everyone for attending today. A huge debt of gratitude for Jacquelyn for giving us her time and her profound insights on such a critical topic. Everyone can expect an email with a link to the recording of this webinar, and that's going to come in the next 24 hours. If you have a question about the recording, not just about the rest of the event, just follow up with us as well. The person to follow up with is Misty. You can reach her at misty@huma.ai. So great job, everyone. It's been a great event, and I'm very happy to have been able to put this together for you all. Everybody have a great afternoon, and hope to hear from you through Misty very soon.